You know, Alice and I are always looking to be more healthy, and we were just talking about how fasting is one of the best ways to do that. But it's so hard. But the great thing about Prolon is that's not what you're doing. It's not that you're not eating for 5 days. Instead, you're using their science-backed program to convince your body you're fasting.
You guys, this 5-day program really is amazing. It comes beautifully packaged and it does all the thinking for you. Each day is its own box. And by following their program, I know I just feel so much better. And I can't wait to experience Prolon Next Gen and continue to see results. For a limited time, you can be first in line to experience the new Next Gen at special savings. Prolon is offering the Prosecutors listeners 15% off site-wide plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe to their 5-day program. Just visit prolonlife.com/prosecutors. That's PROLONLIFE.com/prosecutors to claim your 15% discount and your bonus gift. prolonlife.com/prosecutors.
Two sisters, one a respected TV producer, Jill Blackstone, and the other, Wendy. She was disabled, nearly blind and deaf, and Jill had devoted herself to taking care of Wendy.
Jill was her best friend, her sister, her everything.
But the sister bond was shattered when Wendy and some of the sisters' rescue dogs were found dead in a garage next to a toppled-over barbecue grill. Jill says accidental carbon monoxide poisoning killed everyone. Police do not believe her.
Police arrested Jill Blackstone for the murder of her sister.
Investigators think it was staged to look like an accident.
Who will you believe, especially now that a secret source has come forward with evidence never made public before?
Jill was a good producer. There's no doubt about that. But would she produce murder is the question.
Season 2 of Bad Bad Thing, The Blackstone Sisters, available now wherever you get your podcasts.
I always say, show me a perfect family. I'll show you a family with secrets.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on the Prosecutors, Candyman, well, you get the picture. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my ghostly co-host, Alice.
Brett, all I can say, I don't even know what descriptor you used. I'm just glad you stopped at 2 with Candyman.
Well, there you go. You don't want to go any further than that. You never know what might happen. I mean, usually you have to be looking in the mirror, though. So I don't know if
I'm looking at
yourself.
You.
Yeah.
This is probably the new age mirror right now.
If you see anything behind me, let me know.
Don't creep me out before we start. Come on.
Yeah. And I just got to say, I won't be able to see anything behind you because your background's blurred.
Come on.
How can I save you, Alice? How can I save you? I don't know.
All right. You know what?
Yeah.
You might think
people
I'm
always
pretending.
say it looks like there's a man standing over your shoulder, so.
Stop it. Stop it right now, or you're going to have to do this episode by yourself because I'm legitimately getting freaked out, and it's not even that close to Halloween yet.
It's not. Well, you guys are listening to it. We're now in the second week of October, you lucky people. We're still in September, so we're celebrating early.
Celebrating is Brett's word. Suffering through because I'm such a good friend is another word for me. You're welcome, Brett.
It's true. And those of you who joined us last week for the movie, I hope you enjoyed it. This week, shouldn't be any surprise what we're going to watch this week. Candyman, the 1992 horror classic. Though I'm thinking we may actually watch the 2021 remake as well, which I haven't seen, but I've heard is pretty good. So we may check that out some other time, but we'll watch the original this Friday night. Alice will be joining us live streaming. She can't wait. No?
I'll probably be watching a Halloween movie on the Disney Channel or something.
There you
Y'all
go.
can join me.
Hey, Disney's Halloween, the clip show is fantastic. If you've never seen The Night on Bald Mountain from Fantasia, that is great.
Fantastic.
That is so good. That, I often think about what turned me into a horror lover. And I've got to say, the two things, Disney's Halloween Treat, which was like a 2-hour-long compilation of various spooky things from Disney, which ended, or included, I don't know if it ended with it, but it included Night on Bald Mountain. And then obviously Thriller, the Thriller video of Michael Jackson, which is amazing. So check all that out if you guys are looking for something to watch this Halloween. And with that, are you ready to start talking about the case today, Alice?
Yeah, I was trying to get my wits about me and not be so scared so I can be professional right now.
Well, we are talking about Candyman for a reason, and not just because we want to see it. Number one, it's a nice sort of follow-up to what we did last week when we talked about the original Candyman who murdered his own son by poisoning Halloween candy. It's interesting, the 2021 Candyman, which I haven't seen, but according to Wikipedia, and Wikipedia is never wrong, actually begins with the murder of a homeless black man who was accused of giving a white child a razor blade and a piece of candy, which I thought was interesting. Just continuing that urban legend, even today, even in 2021. So the original Candyman, which I think the remake does this as well, but it doesn't start the same way as the 2021 version. Those of you who haven't seen it, it's a pretty complicated movie. I mean, it's kind of deep. It's not just a horror movie. It deals with issues of race. It deals with issues of poverty. It takes place in Chicago, in one of the poorest areas in Chicago, in an infamous place, the Cabrini Green Homes. And that's where the movie takes place, and it deals with a lot of these issues that in 1992 were still very much, it's not like they've moved on, but we're very much at the forefront of people's consciousness. But what a lot of people don't know is that the movie Candyman actually has some inspiration from something that actually happened. And if you don't know this story is going to freak you out, number one. Number two, it's going to make you mad, because it's the kind of story that should make you mad, and it's going to stick with you. So you're in for a ride today if this is not a story you know. And one of the things about Candyman, the movie, that's interesting is this notion of the power of a name. Doesn't really have anything to do with our main story, but it's something I wanted to talk about, because this is this idea in Candyman that you look in the mirror, and if you say Candyman a certain number of times, Candyman will appear. And a lot of you grew up knowing this as the Bloody Mary legend. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, know about Bloody Mary, which is a similar thing. You go into the bathroom, you turn off the lights, you say Bloody Mary's name enough times, and she's going to appear. And this whole idea of a name having power goes back to as far as we really know. Some of you who are familiar with the legends of the fairy, the fae people, if you ever meet a fairy, do not tell them your name, because if you tell them your name, they will have power over you. So the traditional advice that's given to people who meet a fairy is either tell them a nickname or a fake name. And if at any point they tell you their name, you'll have power over them as well. So all of this stuff is wrapped up in this, low budget horror flick from 1992. It's drawing from real life. It's drawing from legends. Really kind of an amazing movie if you think about it. And the reason I think that it stuck with people for all these years. But let's talk about the real story behind the legend. And if you want to read this story, we've linked to it. It's a great one, a great article in a publication called the Chicago Reader. I don't even know if the Chicago Reader is still around, but you can read this story as it was published back in the 1980s. And as we often do, we're going to scratch the surface and give you the high points, but beautifully written article, well worth reading. And it tells the story of Ruthie Mae McCoy. Now, Ruthie Mae McCoy lived in the Adams, Brooks, Loomis, and Abbott apartment buildings in Chicago, known by residents as ABLA. Now, ABLA was a housing project. It was meant to provide homes for low-income Chicagoans who worked and the railroad yards near the location. Now, many of these residents were black, and a lot of them had actually moved to Chicago for economic opportunity and to avoid racism, segregationist laws in the South. In fact, during a period known as the Great Migration, 6 million African American Southerners moved to the North and Midwest, and many of them came to Chicago. And that period was a period of sort of a boom period. It was a period of cultural flowering. It was a period of economic advancement for people who really didn't have many opportunities at all where they were coming from, but now suddenly did have that. You see that in sort of the Harlem Renaissance, the Chicago Sound, a lot of the stuff that was going on. There was a period in the beginning of this that was pretty good. But over time, the same sort of economic downturn that would affect a lot of places would hit Chicago hard, and it would hit hardest in this area. As we said, a lot of people were coming to Chicago to do things like work in the rail yard, but as the economy changed and the railroad jobs moved out, poverty moved in. And ABLA very quickly fell into the grips of poverty, as well as its larger, more famous companion, Cabrini Green. A lot of you probably heard of Cabrini Green because it became emblematic of this problem around the country. And with poverty came crime, a lot of it, and soon the residents were terrorized by various gangs, including the Black Gangster Disciples, who are one of the more famous gangs still around today, but at the time just had an absolute grip on this area to the extent that high-ranking members of the Black Gangsters Disciples essentially just ran these buildings and terrorized the people who lived there with no repercussions whatsoever and no attempts by the police to stop them.
And I think this is really interesting because, you know, we've talked about legend, we've kind of talked about the spookiness of the movie, but now we're really digging into a very interesting time period in a very interesting part of Chicago. And, you know, Cabrini Green no longer exists today, but if you haven't read one of my favorite books, I think you should really read it. It's called There Are No Children Here, and it's by Alex Kotlowitz, and it happens around this time of this story we're about to tell you. Alex Kotlowitz was a journalist who followed two brothers, I believe they were brothers, two young boys who were about 11 or 12 years old, who lived near ABLA, right next to Cabrini Green, in the Chicago projects. And they were African-American boys kind of coming of age. And he watched their lives, and he documents the utter violence and just sadness of the lives that they had lived in these projects, and kind of their entire community crumbling around them and falling victim to these gangs and to drugs and to a real fear and skepticism of law enforcement, which is all going to come into play in today's episode. So that it's a nonfiction book, but I think it was one of the most powerful books I've ever read about what it's like to live during the late 80s, early 90s within this set of housing projects in Chicago, which no longer exists the way it is told in this story anymore because it got so bad that essentially all they could do was raise all these housing projects in hopes of fixing the problems that gripped it. So with that background, let's talk about Ruthie Mae McCoy. Ruthie lived on the 11th floor of the ABLA building at 1440 West 13th Street. She lived at the end of the corridor in apartment 1109, and her entire life, Ruthie suffered from paranoia and mental illness, with her problems appearing in her early 20s. The paranoia was probably something healthy, honestly, living in ABLA, because as we've just told you about, ABLA and the housing projects around were incredibly dangerous. So her paranoia actually helped her be healthily skeptical of all of the things happening in her community, and maybe was the only way that some people could avoid becoming a victim of crime. Ruthie often would walk around and test the doorknobs of her neighbors, and when she found an open door, she would chastise her neighbors for not being safe. Ruthie was known to terrorize children who misbehaved, and she often carried a stick with her that she threatened them with. Despite all of these kind of idiosyncrasies, Ruthie believed that someone was after her. And she would tell her doctors about it at the outpatient psychiatric facility she'd visit at Mount Sinai Hospital. But her fears were largely disregarded, just kind of as the ravings of a disturbed mind. Still, Ruthie persevered, and though she was in her 50s, She recognized kind of her station in life, but she wanted to better herself. She was taking a GED program, and she wanted to do the most with what she had.
And sometimes when you hear this story, they kind of skip over this part because I think sometimes they want you to think, I mean, look, everybody's trying to tell a good story, and Ruthie being really paranoid and really, scared of everything around her is important for what we're going to talk about in a second. But Ruthie was very much attempting to better her life. She was dealing with these issues. She was going to the doctor, and she was trying to put herself in a position where, despite her age, she could do something better and get out of the place where she was at. And she'd been living in ABLA for about 4 years in April 1987. On the 22nd of April, Ruthie called 911 at 8:45 p.m. She begged for help, telling the operator that someone was coming through her bathroom to get her. The dispatcher wasn't sure what Ruthie was trying to tell her, nor did he understand how someone could come through the bathroom to get after her. But he did dispatch a police car to the area. But he didn't record it as a break-in, only a neighbor disturbance. And hindsight's 20/20, but you can sort of understand this. I mean, she's saying they're coming through the bathroom, they're coming through the mirror, they're coming through the cabinet. What in the world does that mean if you're just an operator? I think what you probably think is somebody's banging on the wall. That's what you're thinking. So you're thinking neighbor disturbance. She's not saying someone's trying to break in my front door. And he, I think, does the best he can with the information that he's gotten, and he relays that to the police. But because it's not a break-in, it's just a neighbor disturbance, in Chicago in that time, in that area, that is pretty low on the list of danger and on the list of priorities. But at 9:02, so about 17 minutes later, the police receive another phone call. And this time, it's not from Ruthie, and it's not something as simple as someone banging on the wall. A woman in the building reports that she heard gunshots on the 11th floor. 2 minutes later, another neighbor would call, reporting those same gunshots and yelling in room 1109, the same room that Ruthie had just called 911 from.
At 9:10 p.m., 4 police officers arrived. They pounded on the door, calling for Ruthie, but no one answered. They radioed to the dispatcher and asked him to call Ruthie back. In fact, they could hear from outside of Ruthie's apartment, her phone ringing inside the apartment, but no one answered. By the way, red flag. We know that Ruthie had just called the dispatcher, and we hear the phone ringing, so there's no problem with the connection, and they know that no one's picking up. The police, they are concerned that someone was in the apartment, maybe threatening Ruthie, and so they went over to the housing project office to get a key. Brett, if you think someone's threatening me in my room, don't go get a key. Just ram down the door, okay? Just, every second counts is all I'm saying.
Very thoughtful police officers about the integrity of the doors in this housing project.
Story.
I mean, I respect their concern for private property.
Well, so they walk away. They try to go get a key to, I guess, go about this the right way. They were worried about violating your constitutional rights, Brett. That's what's going on.
There you go. That's the
saying this a little tongue-in-cheek because this gets a little more egregious.
It's a lot more egregious.
It gets a lot more egregious. They get the key from the housing project office, and lo and behold, the key does not fit into Ruthie's door. Because apparently, due to her paranoia, Ruthie had changed the locks. The police debated what to do. They had a key. It didn't work. No one was answering the door. They thought perhaps Ruthie was in trouble on the other side. Should they break down the door? I mean, the apartments around 1109 were empty because there was skepticism of law enforcement, and the neighbors on the floor just weren't interested in speaking with the police. They would call 911, but that's about the level of involvement they wanted with law enforcement, and that's what happened here. Neighbors did call when they heard yelling and gunshots, but they were not willing to be part of any sort of investigation. All they would tell cops is an elderly woman lived in 1109 and that she always answered the door. That's all they would say. But what they did know was right now, while the police were knocking on the door after she had called for the police, she was not answering the door. The police speculated to the dispatcher that maybe Ruthie had answered the door to the wrong person. Also a horrifying situation.
And so now you have a situation where the police have a 911 call coming from inside this very apartment. They have another call of gunshots in the building. Another call of screaming from inside this apartment and gunshots. They have someone inside who always answers the door, but is not answering the door now, and in fact is not answering the phone when they call, and they are speculating that the absolute worst has happened. So at this point, the police do exactly what you would expect. With no key and a great concern for what has happened to Ruthie, they decide to leave. By 9:48, they had cleared the scene.
I don't know how you clear the scene. Like, literally just look around and be like, I don't see anything because I can't get through the door, so I'm going to clear this scene.
You know, I mean, hey, I guess I don't know what to tell you, Alice. I mean, what are they supposed to do? What are they supposed to do? It's not like they have any reason to think there's an emergent situation here that would require them to break down the door or to take some sort of action.
And by the way, they would be justified in doing so.
Yes, they would.
In case any of you are thinking of my previous comment about constitutional rights here, this is for an emergent situation, for potentially preventing bad things happening. It's okay.
And you know, there's a lot going on here, and there's a lot to unpack probably in this decision. Once again, I mean, it's the 1980s.
I will say, though, I think it is very relevant, though, the skepticism of this entire area with law enforcement. So we don't have neighbors on their side. They are outnumbered generally. When you read some of the contemporaneous articles and stories from this time, it is true that the criminal elements of the neighborhood ran the place, and police officers were afraid of them. They often didn't go inside of these housing projects because they were not trusted, so they would usually be run out in a violent manner. I'm giving as much sort of leeway to the cops in this instance, but the difference here is they're already in. Right? They're already in here. No one's threatening them to get out. It's quite the opposite. What they know of is that it's an old lady living in 1109. It's not known to be, say, some crack house or some drug dealer's den with a bunch of young, very strong men living in there who could potentially threaten them. So that part, I think, what I've just described as potentially the reason why they would make the decision they did is kind of out the window because of the information they have since gathered coming in.
This message comes from Greenlight. Ready to start talking to your kids about financial literacy? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app that teaches kids and teens how to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest with your guardrails in place. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Join millions of parents and kids building healthy financial habits together on Greenlight. Get started risk-free at greenlight.com/Wondery.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
This is a mini meditation guided by Bombas. Repeat after me. I'm comfy. I'm cozy. I have 0 blisters on my toes. And that's because I wear Bombas, the softest socks, underwear, and t-shirts that give back. One purchased equals one donated. Now go to bombas.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY at checkout.
Craving your next action-packed adventure? Audible delivers thrills of every kind on your command, like Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, where a lone astronaut must save humanity from extinction, narrated with stunning intensity by Ray Porter. From electrifying suspense and daring quest to spine-tingling horror and romance in far-off realms, Unleash your adventurous side with gripping titles that'll keep you guessing. Discover exclusive Audible originals, hotly anticipated new releases, and must-listen bestsellers that hook you from the first minute. Because Audible knows there's no greater thrill than the one that speaks to you. Discover what lies beyond the edge of your seat. Start your free 30-day trial at audible.com/WonderyUS. That's audible.com/WonderyUS.
But that's not going to be the end of our story, and the police are going to get another opportunity. Because by the next evening, a neighbor, Deborah Lastly, she called the police. And she told them that normally Ruthie would stop by and see her every day, both in the morning when Ruthie would go for her daily walk and in the evening before Ruthie would go to bed. But she hadn't seen her that day, either in the morning or in the evening. And that made her concerned, particularly combined with what had happened the night before. And it led her to believe that something had gone terribly wrong. So the police respond again. This time they meet the Chicago Housing Authority security guards at Ruthie's door. They knock at the door, but they hear nothing. The guards had been trying to figure out if they had a key to this door. They couldn't find one. And so there's no way to get in without busting the door down. And the police say, okay, well, let's go ahead. Let's bust the door down. Let's find out what is going on inside. But the guards, they're like, I don't know about that. I don't know whether we should bust the door down because somebody could sue us. They might get mad that we're busting down their door. We might end up having to pay for that door. And frankly, they didn't want to have to go through the trouble of replacing it. I mean, this is the kind of place where stuff's always breaking and it's not getting replaced. And there's talk about how dangerous the stairwells were in this building because there were no lights in the stairwells or no windows in the stairwells, and the lights were always burning out. So you'd have like one light every few floors. And you can imagine what happened in the darkness of those stairwells. So replacing a door is going to be a big deal. We can barely replace light bulbs, right? So they're like, I don't know, should we really break down the door, guys? I mean, this is going to be a huge problem for us. I mean, imagine the paperwork, right? So faced with these insurmountable obstacles, everybody decides, what they did last night worked out pretty well. So how about we just all go home? And once again, they clear the scene.
Thank goodness for a good Samaritan, because Ruthie's neighbor Lastly didn't give up. And thank goodness she didn't give up, because the next day she convinced she was just going to take matters in her own hands. Security guards, the police officers, they literally stand out the door hemming and hawing, not knowing what to do. So she says, you know what? I'm going to get me a carpenter. She convinces a carpenter to drill through the lock on Ruthie's door, and they open the door. And tragically and unsurprisingly, in a pool of blood lay Ruthie Mae McCoy. She'd been shot 4 times, once in the thigh, once in the left shoulder, once through the abdomen, and once through her upper right arm. Obviously, she was long gone. And the only saving grace of this entire tragedy was that the final bullet had passed through her arm and into the chest cavity, severing the pulmonary artery. So even if the police had shown more concern that very first night, McCoy was probably already dead when they arrived at her room, and even if she wasn't, she wouldn't have survived long enough to save her at the hospital. And as tragic as the story is, what's remarkable is how common this kind of murder was. Unfortunately, Ruthie's story was one of many. 2 days after Ruthie was killed, one of Ruthie's neighbors was beaten to death. 3 days after that, another resident was stabbed to death. I mean, we can't overestimate the amount of violence in this area. And that, who knows how that factored into how the police acted. But we'll talk more about Ruthie's death here. Man, Brett, if it weren't for Miss Lastly, I don't know when they would have gone in. Like, when the stench was too intense, and then still they would say, well, we can't break down the door.
Yeah, I don't know what they would have done or when they would have gone in, but I think you pointed out the violence of the area. I think there is a little bit of, you become desensitized to that kind of violence, and I think it was just so expected, and gunshots were so expected, and people being killed was so expected that it did not have the urgency that you might expect. And I'm not making excuses for anybody in this situation. I mean, these are some really bad decisions that were made by a lot of people over the course of these 2 nights that led up to this. But if you're sitting there in your car, as most of you probably are, utterly dumbfounded by the story that we have just told you, I think the best explanation that you can get is people were desensitized to it, and there was just a lack of concern and care, and there was a lack of urgency by anybody. And so, you know, when they finally went in and they found this, number one, they probably weren't that surprised. But despite the fact they will now begin an investigation of the murder, it's one of so many that they're dealing with in this area. And we talked about that article. It was written about this. I mean, that was really sort of the perspective of the article, is this was just one case of many, many, many that were happening. And the article is terrifying because it goes through just the violence in that area. We talked about children earlier and how quickly children became members of these gangs and how dangerous very young children were in this area. And it's something that I think is surprising to most people who read it, but wouldn't have been surprising to the police. And I think they unfortunately allowed that sort of complacency to set up a situation where murder has happened and it takes 3 days. A murder has happened with the victim calling 911 the night it happened, and it took them 3 days to find the body. And it's unexcusable. But while there was a lot of violence in this area, there was something about this case that was remarkable. A fact that cut through the real but unfortunate haze of murder and death that covers the Chicago projects then and now, and actually led to some coverage of this. Ordinarily, deaths in the projects didn't even make the paper, didn't even merit a blurb in the paper, but this one started to attract some attention. The police arrested 2 people, and the theory that they had for how they entered and departed the apartment was remarkable. As we noted, no one had a key to Ruthie's apartment, no one but her. There was a thought that maybe she had let somebody in, but the door was locked from the inside when the police arrived. How was that possible? The motive for the killing was obvious. The television and some other things had been taken, and it turned out that Ruthie had recently gotten an increase in her Social Security check, one that included a retroactive bump and thus a large initial payment. And unfortunately, people in the complex knew about it. That she was robbed wasn't all that surprising to anyone. But how were the items that were stolen taken out of the apartment, then the door locked from the inside, and then the people or person responsible, how did they escape?
It was a locked door mystery, but one of the police believed they had figured it out. I mean, truly, the situation looks dumbfounding, right? We know that there was a call from inside. There wasn't much time between the time that dispatcher called for police and police to arrive before we heard the commotion inside 1109. And there were a lot of eyes on 1109, especially after she called for police to come. There was no sighting of people running out the door, somehow being able to lock from the inside, climbing through windows. This is the 11th floor. And so this is truly a head scratcher. But as the police began to look around the apartment, they began to figure out what may have happened. When Ruthie had called about the killers coming in through her bathroom, she wasn't crazy. This was not a figment of her imagination. They had, in fact, come in right through her bathroom mirror, just like a murderer in a horror movie, and truly horrific. I can imagine her standing there and hearing something from the bathroom, a bathroom that is not an entry from the outside, and not knowing what to do about it. You can't run out. You can't run in. There's nowhere to go. It's truly the stuff of nightmares. And to be more specific, it wasn't just generally the bathroom, but through the bathroom medicine cabinet that held the mirror. So something of a pretty small size. You see, when they built these projects, they had built them with a very specific design aspect. Unfortunately, I would say a design flaw because of what happened. You see, there was a 2-foot space between the walls of the apartments that allowed plumbers and other handymen to work on piping and electrical problems with the apartments. Large enough basically for tunnels to run through the walls of these apartments. And the only way that these tunnels in the walls were sealed off from the apartments were these cabinets that held these medicine cabinet mirrors. And it's not like they were soldered on and held in place to be sturdy. No. Like many things in the projects, it was kind of a shoddy job. The cabinets were jammed into a hole in those walls, secured by a mere 6 nails. It wasn't long before thieves recognized that you could climb up and down the floors on pipes and then in between the walls to different apartments. Bursting through the medicine cabinets had become a common way to rob people.
To the extent that some people who lived in the apartment complexes had figured out ways to jam their bathroom door at night. So they had like these complex ways of keeping the bathroom door shut because they knew that people could come in through the wall into their bathroom. So the only way to keep them from coming into their apartments and murdering them or stealing all they had was to somehow lock the bathroom door, which wasn't always easy. And this was not only a way to get into apartments, but it was a way for drug dealers to operate in some of the floors that had become basically floor-wide drug operations. You would have a room where you would be selling the drugs, but if the police came, you could pop through the wall, climb down the pipes into another room, and the police would be none the wiser. So just sort of a bizarre thing that really, until this happened, people in the apartments knew about this, but the police were not generally aware of it. But now they were, and they were even able to identify and arrest 2 suspects. A 19-year-old Edward Turner, who, when they found him, he had Ruthie's television, and 25-year-old John Hondras. Hondras' relatives had lived in apartment 1108, and he had used another apartment that they lived in to actually enter into Ruthie's. So these are pretty good connections between these two people. One guy has the television, and one guy you can sort of trace how he would have got into Ruthie's apartment. Both of them were charged with murder, home invasion, armed robbery, armed violence, and residential burglary. Turner had told a friend that he shot Ruthie, and so the police sought the death penalty for him. Interestingly, Turner sought a jury trial while Hondras had a bench trial. And they did this in one trial. So it was a situation where you'd have the jury in the room. We talked about this a little bit in one of our legal briefs. You'd have the jury in the room for all the evidence that pertained to Hondras. And then when there was evidence that was more specific to Turner, such as his statement to a friend that he had committed the murder, the jury would actually leave, and that evidence would only come in front of the judge. Now, the judge obviously didn't have to leave when evidence is coming in from Hondras because we trust judges to be able to parcel out the evidence and not be swayed by that kind of thing. So don't have that same problem there. But you kept the jury sort of pure by not seeing the evidence that specifically applied to Turner that they might nevertheless apply to Hondras as well. And these two men, you know, they kind of had mutually exclusive arguments. Turner basically said Hondras did it. He broke in, he killed Ruthie, and at some point he had asked Turner for his help moving the TV, and that Turner had ended up with the TV. So he might have robbed her, but he didn't kill her, and that he had nothing to do with the murder. Hondras, on the other hand, said it was all Turner that had done it, and that he helped him get the stuff out of Ruthie's apartment, but that Turner was the guilty party. So you got these two guys who are on trial at the same time who are basically saying it was that guy. And you have a jury and a judge who had to figure this out. And I think it was pretty smart of these two, and I don't know if they talked about this, to have a judge and a jury, not just one jury trying to figure this out. Because you kind of feel like if you had a jury, just one jury, they probably pick one of them. You know what I mean? Like they might not get them both, but they probably pick one of them. But by having a jury and a judge, you know, they each sort of have the opportunity to win, even though you feel like with two guys pointing the finger at each other, one of them is responsible, if not both of them.
That's a really great description of like trial game theory. You know,
Yeah.
That's absolutely right. Because both of them are basically saying, yes, one of us is guilty, but it's not me. And so you can imagine if you have one decision maker, they're going to say, well, we'll roll the dice on one of you or have you both be guilty because we know that you're both kind of at fault. But when you only have the one that you have to make a decision on, I can see where that reasonable doubt comes in and say, I don't know for sure that it's him. So I'm only in charge of finding the facts for this particular defendant. Now, the prosecution relied heavily on the statement of an eyewitness, Tim Brown. Brown was able to testify to essentially everything that happened that night, having been a friend of both defendants. But Brown had problems. He was a convicted drug dealer. We've talked about this before. Your witnesses come to you however they are, and it is really hard to find squeaky clean witnesses, especially when you're talking about this particular, housing project, and also when you're talking about a murder trial. Now, Brown initially lied to the police about his whereabouts that night, and his times were off. He said the murder happened after 11 p.m., but it actually happened around 9 p.m., which we know because of all of those calls and the police actually being outside the door and hearing the phone ring without anyone answering it. And Brown was, unsurprisingly, a terrible witness. On the stand, he contradicted himself and earlier statements he gave. He said that the police had threatened to charge him as an accessory to murder if he didn't finger Turner and Hondras. In fact, Brown now said that it was Hondras and Ronald Bo Coleman who committed the crime. In other words, his testimony was just a mess all over the place. And this is not surprising whatsoever.
Yeah, and this is an interesting case because we've talked about people who turn state witness in other cases. And, oftentimes they have problems, like Alice said. Oftentimes their story will change. Oftentimes they will begin by minimizing their involvement. But your hope is, by the time you get to trial, they're telling the truth and they got their story straight. And then when you put them on the stand, yeah, they're going to be hit for being a drug dealer. Yeah, he's going to be hit for changing his story. Yeah, he's going to be hit for minimizing. But he's going to say to that defense attorney, look, I might have sold drugs, but your guy killed that lady, and I know it. And that's what you hope will happen. And that's not what happened here. Instead, he not only changes his story on the stand, but he basically says, look, the police pressured me into doing this. And I'm sure the police did pressure him. Imagine the situation the police are under. They have not exactly bathed themselves in glory in this case, and I bet they really wanted a conviction, and I think it led them to do some things that are unethical, and I think one of those was putting a lot of pressure. Now, look, telling him, if you lie to us, we're going to charge you as an accessory. I mean, that if he knew and was involved in both murders and he's lying to them, he kind of is an accessory. You see this a lot in these cases where at some point a witness will say, the police threatened me, but what the police actually did was told them the truth about what was going to happen to them if they did not cooperate. Is that a threat? I don't know. Obviously, I guess it depends on which side, you're on in these cases. But I think what probably definitely happened here was they didn't say, tell us the truth or we're going to charge you. They said, tell us these two guys did it or we're going to charge you. And it's really, when you hear him change his story, he changes his story in a very interesting way. He still includes one of them, Hondras, in his story. He still includes Hondras. But now he adds a different guy. And it really makes you wonder. I mean, you talk about reasonable doubt. You're on this jury or you're the judge and you're listening to this story and you're hearing, Turner says that Hondras did it. Hondras says that Turner did it. This guy's supposed to say it's Hondras and Turner, but instead he's saying it's Hondras and Ronald Bo Coleman. And if you're the jury, you only have to decide about Turner. How at that point do you not have reasonable doubt? I mean, yeah, the guy's got the television, but there are lots of ways to imagine how he got that. But that doesn't mean he committed murder.
Especially in these projects, by the way. There was just a lot of stealing all the time and kind of bartering for different items. So, unsurprisingly, the jury did take 4 hours to deliberate, but they ultimately reached a verdict that Turner was not guilty of all charges. He was acquitted. Now, the judge in Hondras' case, because remember, he had the bench trial, had very harsh words for the police department, which I think were deserved.
And that's what's always interesting about judge trials. Jury trials, you get the verdict, they move on, you never hear from them again. But judges write opinions. And they write opinions in bench trials. And you have one in this trial. And this is what he said. And I'm going to read to you guys from this because I think this is a great encapsulation by the judge of everything that went wrong by the police in this case, the prosecutors in this case. I mean, this is one of those, if you wanted to have a case that you could use to teach prosecutors and police how not to do it, this is one of them. So here's what he has to say. There's more than one tragedy in this case. The most obvious is the brutal murder, robbery, and home invasion of Ruthie McCoy. The second is the failure of the Chicago Police Department to respond in a professional manner to Ruthie McCoy's impassioned plea for help. Had the Chicago Police Department performed with minimal competence, they would have, in all probability, recovered evidence. And since it was almost immediately after the event, possibly even the perpetrator, They would not have sustained the obvious removal of evidence and property. The police may have solved the case based upon the evidence, not the ever-changing tales of the perjurious felon, Tim Brown. The case was lost not by the state's attorneys. The case was not even lost by the detectives, who got the only evidence that they got in a damaged and sanitized crime scene. The case was lost by the patrol division of the Chicago Police Department, who stood by with a deaf ear to the multiple reports of gunshots being fired in 1109. They just couldn't be bothered with the hassle of entering a locked door, so they let them get away with it. This defendant may or may not be guilty, but the state has clearly failed to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. This court must accordingly find the defendant not guilty. He is discharged.
So in other words, both of them got off. I mean, those are harsh words, but who cares? He got off. There is absolutely kind of no justice for Ruthie here. Ultimately, it's unclear what happened to Hondros and Turner. But in a way, Ruthie does live on. When Candyman, the movie, was made, the death of Ruthie McCoy was in the minds of the screenwriters. Although the story, The Forbidden, was written by Clive Barker about class differences in his native England, the story of the movie focused on the poverty and death in the Chicago projects, with a focus on Cabrini Green. The movie opens with Ruthie Jean calling 911 to no effect. Her neighbor, Anne Marie McCoy.
So the ABLA high-rises and Cabrini Green are gone now, demolished in favor of less dangerous, more home-like, low-income housing. Obviously, the poverty and the crime have not disappeared despite the cosmetic changes, but the areas where these projects once stood have changed. Gentrification has come to the area, and low-income housing projects have been replaced with posh new bars and restaurants and the stylish lofts that go with them. But a fresh coat of paint and a Starbucks on every corner can't erase the horror that once haunted that neighborhood and sometimes came through the mirror. So yeah, that's a tragic case. It's a tragic case. It's one that I was not aware of until folks in the gallery mentioned we should do the Candyman, and I was like, oh, that's a great movie, but it's not like it's based in reality. And then it turns out it is. So I hope you guys learned something today. As disturbing as that story is, as we said, Ruthie did not get justice in the judicial system, but at least we can remember her and remember what happened to her and hopefully take some lessons away from it.
Indeed. No, I really actually am so glad to learn the real story behind it, because it is such a tragic story. And as much as I do not like horror movies, I do think they did it right in terms of capturing just the violence in this area and bringing to light something that it's not glossed over. A lot have written about it, but I think it was such a uniquely violent time that persists in many communities today. And unless we shed light on them, it's difficult to kind of understand how crime affects these populations.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. We talk about true crime a lot, and why do you do true crime? Why do you listen to true crime? What's the value in true crime? Is it really just voyeurism and all this other stuff? And I don't know. You guys can talk about that in your philosophy classes or whatever. But I think it's important to tell stories, and I think it's important to remember stories. I think there is value in telling this story. I don't know that it changes anything. It doesn't change anything for her and what happened to her. But I think there's value in telling it. I think more people should know it. They should know what happened. I think there are always lessons that can be taken from it. I think it's a case where you see, we talk about police misconduct in a lot of cases, and we talk about where the police go wrong. And we have a tendency in true crime and just in life in general to spin things out into very complex, complicated conspiracies. And I think when we do that, it stops us from being able to address the real problems we have. And here you see the real problems. You see complacency. You see an unwillingness to go. It's hard to even call it the extra mile, the extra inch to do your job in this case. As the judge said, you couldn't even be bothered to go through a locked door. And then you compound that by once you've already have a bad situation, then you've got a witness, you've got somebody who's telling you a story, and you're, rather than listening to what they're saying, because look, I don't know who did this. to be honest with you, it could have been the two guys who were charged. Maybe it's the third guy. I don't know. But it seems like we'll never know, because the one witness who probably did know, his testimony was corrupted by the police who really wanted to get these two guys versus this other guy. And so they, pushed him into the story he told. And what did you end up with? You ended up with two people, at least one of whom was involved in this. I think it's pretty clear at least one of them was involved with it, but they both got away with it. This brutal murder they got away with.
And that's the thing, right? This is one of many, many brutal murders, and many of them have gotten away because there wasn't proper investigation or simply overwhelming, for the prosecutors' offices to bring all these charges. And that's what's so devastating about a lot of the violence in this particular housing project as well over the years, and why they ultimately raised it, is that murders would happen, the police would not be called, or the police would come and no investigation would happen, and ultimately there was no justice for any of the victims. In this case, there was actually a trial. Many of those cases never even went to trial, but I think this particular case, Ruthie's case, highlighted, what was happening tenfold, 20-fold, 100-fold in these housing projects across Chicago and across many communities that were suffering economically in the late 80s. And I think we're seeing today as well. So I think you're absolutely right, Brett. These stories need to be told because history will repeat itself. And also history will repeat itself if we don't change anything about it. And also I think it's important because every life matters, and Ruthie's life matters. Her neighbor, Miss Lasley, recognized that. And thank goodness she's kept on. Hero. She is truly the hero. She kept reaching out and took matters into her own hand. I mean, she literally got a carpenter to drill down the door, and that's the only reason Ruthie was found. Many other victims don't have a Ms. Lasley in their life who go that extra mile to make sure they're okay, to make sure the police take note. If it weren't for her, they wouldn't have come that second day. If they weren't for her, it would have been longer than 3 days before they were able to find Ruthie, and the scene would have been further contaminated. I mean, people would have just been crawling up into her apartment and cleaning it out.
I mean, look, if it hadn't been for her, there's no telling when they would have found her. I mean,
I know some of you think it's when she doesn't pay rent. In these housing projects, most people don't pay rent, truly, because they're either late on it or there's some public assistance, so the check goes straight there. And so Section 8 may have kept paying her rental checks, and no one would have been the wiser because they would have kept getting the payment checks and she would have just been inside. And when there were complaints about a bad smell, guess what? It smelled everywhere in the housing projects, and they weren't about to go clean out some hoarder's apartment just because a couple neighbors on the 11th floor complained about it.
There's a world in which she's not found for years. There is a world in which they go into that apartment years later and they find a skeleton. That is absolutely possible. And once again, she is the hero of this story. There's no question about that. Well, like I said, we're going to watch Candyman this Friday. Join us. It'll be around 8:30 or so after the kids go to bed. I look forward to seeing it. I'll be on Twitter talking about this. So if you're confused about when it's going to happen, just look at our @ProsecutorsPod Twitter profile and you'll see it. Email us if you have thoughts about this story. Would love to hear them. I hope you will check out that story from the Chicago Reader. It's great. There's actually two we're going to link to. The first is the initial story about the murder. And then there's a second story that was written by the same person a couple years later during and after the trial. So two great articles that laid out this entire story and gave a lot more color about the things that were happening in that area, the poverty, the crime. So if you found this episode interesting at all, I hope you guys will check that out. Okay, Alice, do you want to answer some questions? Try and
Absolutely.
We got dark there. I'd like to lighten things up. Okay, so we're going to answer some questions. We're going to answer a question here, and we're not going to give you legal advice, but this person sent this question and I was like, we need to at least answer this because I'm concerned about you. You need to take some steps.
Oh no, I'm scared.
So this person, Pablito, writes, I am currently a finance accounting student major at a junior college in Mississippi. However, I love law and I've been so interested in true crime. Only downside is I am undocumented. I know, TMI, sorry, but I have been trying to research whether I could still get licensed certified being undocumented. Unfortunately, I was 5 months too late to qualify for DACA. I'm 19 right now. Been in the U.S. for 16 years. Anyway, sorry for the rant. Okay. So basically, once again, we're not going to give legal advice, but I do think, Pablito, you should go to a lawyer because your circumstance is so precarious. And I know you know that, but being in that situation, I mean, number one, don't let anybody at your college know that, because I think there's all sorts of bad things that could happen, obviously, given your situation, given your sort of shaky situation. So go to an immigration lawyer, find out what exactly you need to do. As to your question about whether or not you could get into law enforcement and those sort of areas, that's gonna be difficult, I think, under your current situation. There may be certain states where you can. Don't know that Mississippi would be one of them. So I would advise you to go see a lawyer as soon as possible and really figure out your situation and what you need to do to sort of make sure that you're on solid footing going forward.
Right. And just to be clear, going to the lawyer would help you find a path to basically fix the undocumented part so that some of the obstacles you've noted, I don't know that there's any way to overcome the obstacles otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's just totally going to depend on what state you're in, whether or not you're going to be able to do certain things if you can't show some sort of proof of citizenship. I mean, as you know, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. This is an incredibly complicated, controversial subject. There is a mass of federal laws, a maze of federal laws that deal with this, state laws that deal with this. I mean, it is just a complete mess. And it is such a difficult place for you to be. You're 19 years old. You've been in the country as long as you can remember, but you don't have that piece of paper you need to enable you to do a lot of things. And in fact, if the smallest thing goes wrong for you, I don't know what would happen. I have done immigration law before. I've done immigration prosecutions before. And sometimes you see people who are in the country, they're undocumented, they're here illegally, however you want to describe it, and something goes wrong. And it can be the tiniest thing. And somebody runs that information and finds it out, and all of a sudden they find themselves
like a traffic ticket.
Yeah, exactly, like a traffic ticket. I mean, actually, I remember cases where somebody would get a traffic ticket, they go to traffic court, they're walking out of traffic court, and there's an ICE agent waiting on them because they've been notified. And they arrest them. And then all of a sudden, there's deportations happening. There's just a lot of issues there. So my advice, before you start thinking about that, go talk to a lawyer and try and get yourself in as solid a position as you can.
With all of that, not to scare you too much, but also just wanted to say, really impressed with everything you've done with, your life so far. And it sounds like you will have a bright future. I think I've told this story before, but kind of on how that small issue can be the triggering effect for huge things that, you didn't come here by yourself. You were just a baby when you came. I was riding my bike in Washington, D.C., and I got hit by a car. The car just totally ran a red light, turned when they weren't supposed to, and smashed me head on. My bike broke in half. I was thankfully okay, but it was a pretty bad hit, and a bunch of people stopped. And the person driving the car was a very young person, looked to be maybe 16, ran out of the car, was freaking out for me, very kind of this person. And, was talking really fast. And I said, calm down. And I just said, the police were already getting called. And he was and he just started yelling at me. He was like, I'm undocumented. And I said to him, I'm okay. Get in the car and go. Because it was going to be really bad. And I just didn't. I was okay. I was physically okay. nothing was broken that I could tell. And I could buy a new bike. But all I could think in my mind was I'm alive. That's all that matters right now.
Yeah. And if if he had been there when the police showed up, there's no telling exactly what would happen to him. And it depends on.
I do know what would have happened. It would have been really bad.
And, it's just, there's so much. It's so complicated. It's hard to even say. I think currently, I don't know what enforcement priorities are in that area. But nevertheless, go find a lawyer. Talk to a lawyer. Talk to a real lawyer and just find out. And the answer may be, unfortunately, that there are really no things you can do to fix that problem. And if that's true, then I think probably what you need to do is find a state that has a less restrictive policy on what jobs you can have and that sort of thing. I think that's what you're gonna have to do. You're just gonna have to do a lot of research on the law.
The good news, if you can't afford a lawyer, is especially in the immigration realm, there's probably a lot of people doing pro bono. So don't let that deter you if you're thinking you don't have the financial ability to go to a lawyer.
Yeah, I got a friend who's an immigration lawyer, so send me an email if you want to, and we can connect you with people. But anyways, just wanted to do that because I read that review and thought, appreciate that you're thinking about your future, but we need to get the present nailed down first. So wanted to address that. Okay, less serious ones now. This is from Wrecked Ideas. Would you two come to my art gallery and host a true crime talk? Obviously.
I can think of nothing better.
Like, why are you leaving that in an email?
Galleries.
You should be emailing us, not leaving that in a review. I mean, come on.
So in all truthfulness, we keep saying that we're going to go on tour, and we never do.
We've been meaning to.
Partly because we're lazy, and partly because you have to find a location and then go there. So if you have a location and a city you want us to go to, reach out to us and we will come.
Yeah, we'll come. All we need is a plane ticket and a bottle of bourbon, and we're there. So, speaking of bourbon, tonight I am drinking Knocking on Heaven's Door, which was a gift from my buddy Rich, who consulted with us on the Ben McDaniels, the dude, the scuba diver. Ooh. Buddy Rich is a scuba diver, had scuba dived in that area, is absolutely convinced he is not in that cave. And I saw him recently, and he gave me Knocking on Heaven's Door bourbon, which is Bob Dylan's bourbon, and it is excellent. So if you're looking for bourbon and you like Bob Dylan, Knocking on Heaven's Door. Good place to be. All right, let's answer one more question, and then we're going to give you some book recommendations. Alice has already given you one. I'm going to give you some horror book recommendations, and a movie. And this one, I think I know the answer to, but I'm not sure, because with Alice, you never know.
Okay, here we go.
This is from Dr. Katie DDS, and she says, do you have any tattoos? If so, what and where? The answer for me, unsurprisingly, I think to most people, is I don't have any tattoos because I'm boring like that. But I think really what we're all wondering is, does Alice have any tattoos?
I don't feel like I want to release a secret yet. Maybe this needs to be, okay, I will not answer this question yet, just to have some mystery in life, because when you have a podcast and you have hundreds of hours of yourself speaking, there are no more secrets. But I will tell you this story. When I was a teenager, and I wasn't even a rebellious teenager, I think you can all tell that I was actually a very straight and narrow person, still am. When I was a teenager, people were getting tattoos and getting their belly button pierced, and I was part of the dance team. And so a lot of the, dancers had lots of piercings and tattoos and things like that. And so my mom saw this amongst all my friends, and she sat down one day, and, my mom's a tiny Asian woman who barely speaks English. And she said this all in Chinese. She said, I noticed that your friends are all getting tattoos and piercings. And I said, yeah, kind of smug. And she said, I thought she was going to ask me if I had any. And she said, I just want you to know I fully support whatever you choose to do. So much so that whatever you do, I'm going to do the same thing. So if you get your belly button pierced, I'll get my belly button pierced. If you get a tramp stamp, I'll get a tramp stamp bigger. So you just tell me where and when, and we'll go together. And I was like...
Wow, that's the best preventative parenting ever.
I was like, I did not expect that coming. And I was like, now it's an amazing story, but 16-year-old Alice, I was like, what?
That is
so maybe at
awesome.
Another Q&A, I will tell you guys if her tactic was
if you
successful.
and your mom headed down
matching
to the
tramp
tattoo
stamps.
shop. There you go. I love it. Well, that's quite a way to end on. So it is Halloween. I wanted to give you guys a few options of books to read, because some people like to read books. There's a fantastic book called A Night in the Lonesome October, which I read every year, cover to cover, in October, because the chapters are actually, there's one chapter for each day. So you're a little bit behind if you start now, but it's okay. You can catch up. And each day tells a story. It's all part of one story, but each day tells us the story of that day, and it is told from the perspective of a dog. So it's a great book. It is fantastic. It's amazing. It is hard for me to recommend it any higher than I do. A Night in the Lonesome October. Incredible book. It includes a lot of classic monsters, Lovecraftian entities, Jack the Ripper, Dracula. It's great. So if you haven't read it, you should check it out. And like I said, we read with my daughter, and eventually with my daughter and son, we read one chapter a day. As the days go, we're reading a chapter, and it's great. So that's a great one. Another, if you have not read The Haunting of Hill House. The Haunting of Hill House, one of the best books ever written. It's by Shirley Jackson. Made a couple movies out of it. The original is really good. There have been a lot of movies made out of it, but the original book is fantastic. You will love it. It's a famous one, so if you're looking for sort of a famous horror novel, it's a good one. If you're looking for a less well-known horror novel, there's a book called The Fisherman by John Langan, and it is absolutely incredible. It's unlike anything you've ever read. Another one I highly recommend. So those are three books. I'll probably recommend some more books as we go on, but 3 books that you should read. I recommended a bunch of movies last time. I do want to recommend an additional one that I forgot that is one of my favorite movies ever made. I promise you, you will love it as much as I do. It's called A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. And it is the most unique movie about vampires you'll ever see. So check that one out. It's beautiful. It is a beautiful movie. I'll watch it pretty much every year, but if you watch it, you will enjoy it, and it will make you have an even better Halloween than you're already going to have. All right, Alice, do you have anything else to add before we sign off?
No, this was a very interesting episode. I'm really glad we covered Ruthie's story. So thank you to those who kind of threw out Candyman for us to do, because this is actually one that I did enjoy.
Well, good. I'm glad you enjoyed it, and this is only the second week in October. We got 3 more to go. So those of y'all who love Halloween, we are just getting started. And we will see you guys next week with a new story, a new spooky story, guaranteed to scare Alice. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors.
San Francisco. I will find it and I will post it somewhere because it was so good. I cannot remember off the top.
When she finds it, we'll comment on Patreon on one of these posts. So read the comments. But I mean, Wenzel's is good. It's good if you like seafood. The original. The chain's kind of but the original is really good. So we should do that. Okay, we ready to get back into the...
Oh, yeah.
Now we did that interview with that guy, and he was like 3, 2, 1, and he would do it. I was like, wow, he's so professional. Okay, let's answer a question.
Dumb waiter's really good too. It's like
terrible service though.
Terrible service, but cool name.
I was joking. Do they really have terrible service?
No, not really. I thought you were just... I was like, you're so mean.
No, I was joking about the name of the restaurant.
No, it's like a dumb waiter.
Not funny if you had to explain the joke.
Dive into true crime on Pluto TV. Unravel the mysteries with Forensic Files and 48 Hours. Investigate crimes with Dateline 24/7 and unsolved mysteries. With thousands of free crime movies and TV shows, Pluto TV is the true home of crime. Download the Pluto TV app on all your favorite devices and start streaming true crime on live channels and on demand. Pluto TV. Stream now, pay never.